Hello and welcome. You're listening to the American Interest Podcast with me, Richard Aldous. My guest this week is Barry Gewen, a long-time editor at the New York Times Book Review and author of the new book, The Inevitability of Tragedy, Henry Kissinger and His World. Barry, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So congratulations on the new book. Before we turn to Henry Kissinger's world, what about yours? This must be a very strange time and experience to bring out a book during the current lockdown.
Yes, it is. I'm rather fatalistic about the whole thing. I mean, there have been, obviously my book party was canceled or postponed. There have been one or two speaking engagements that have been postponed. But I'm rather fatalistic about the whole thing because there's nothing else one can do or say. I mean, this is just an event beyond anyone's control. So there's no reason to be anything but just a bit disappointed about the whole thing.
Well, we're certainly thrilled to have you on the podcast. And what a character to work on. As you say near the beginning of the book, I mean, this is a man with an incredible presence for one who hasn't held office since January 1977.
Yes, I think that's really quite amazing, actually. If his presence these days obviously is not what it was, but the man is 97 or nearly 97, and he deserves a break. But if you go back as recently as the 2016 Democratic primary campaign, when Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were facing off, he was a divisive element even then. Hillary Clinton had referred to Kissinger as a friend, and Bernie Sanders attacked her for that, and of course picked up a lot of support within the Democratic Party because there is a kind of orthodoxy out there among certain sectors of the left that Kissinger is a war criminal and there's nothing more that need be said. But obviously, it's all so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and on that specific thing that you've just spoken about there, you say what was astonishing about this kerfuffle is that it occurred when Kissinger was 93 years old and had been out of government for almost 40 years. Indeed, mention of his name in 2016, if anything, had enraged his critics even more than in the past. Everyone seemed frozen in time.
I think that's right. If you go back and look at the changes in the public image of him, in the early 70s, he was the man who could do no wrong. He was on the covers of both Time and Newsweek in the same week. His popularity had soared to over 80%, which was unheard of. He was considered the most popular man in the country, ahead of the president, whose popularity was then sinking because of the Watergate scandal. But such perennial idols as Billy Graham, Kissinger was more popular than Billy Graham. Playboy bunnies said the man they would most like to have a date with was Henry Kissinger. And think of Kissinger. Think of this squat, sort of roundish, frizzy-haired man, and this is the figure that the Playboy bunnies were most interested in socializing with. And so at that point, there was almost a unanimity about him. And that fell apart. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to examine why that fell apart and what was going on there. And as the popularity fell apart, he became an ogre not only to the left because they viewed him as a war criminal, but to the right as well. What happened was that the center did not hold, and the left and the right both had their reasons for attacking him, and his reputation plummeted.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating just how high that reputation was in the 70s. You spend a lot of time talking about that, not just the Playboy Club, but also the significant achievements with the SALT talks and Nixon in China and kind of so on. And you have that wonderful line where you say a joke made the rounds that Kissinger had better not die because then Nixon would become president.
Yes, yes. That really was the mood of the time. And there was an effort actually to introduce a constitutional amendment so that he'd be able to run for president, which he wasn't able to do since he wasn't born in the U.S. So one of my chapters is really a lengthy discussion about how that all changed. And the change is quite remarkable because he does go from being this incredible idol of the public to someone who's hated for a whole variety of reasons by people who would have nothing to do with each other except for the fact that they detested Henry Kissinger. And so I try to explain that. And in my explanation, I try to suggest that this is a quality of the American character, that the American people are in favor of promoting democracy around the world. There is a general feeling that we are an exceptional nation. There's a general feeling that problems have a solution and that the solution generally involves democracy and then more democracy. And Kissinger didn't believe any of that. And that became clear, and I think it became a source of why he became widely hated.
And it is one of the fault lines which runs through the book, actually, is the way in which he's seen by professionals, including historians now, and the way in which he's seen by political operatives and the wider public. For example, you quote in the book the survey that was done just a couple of years ago of scholars in international relations from well over 1,000 American colleges and universities. They were asked to name the most effective Secretary of State of the last 50 years. Kissinger came in first with 32% of the vote. I think you quote number 2 in that survey as being don't know.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think there is that fault line, though I'm not sure how clear it is in the following sense. I think among the public, there's a general feeling of either ignorance of Kissinger or dislike of Kissinger. But I think among the experts and the professionals, there's a division, that there are people who share the general public image, that is, experts who share the general public image. Let's not forget there have been a number of biographies and other works on Kissinger that take a very hostile stand to him. So I think the fault line is there, but it's not either or. That is to say, there are professionals who line up with the general public opinion.
One of the things that I love about this book is that it's not just rehashing Henry Kissinger, as you say, in a way that has been perhaps done before. You really do present him. First of all, this is in many ways an intellectual biography, it seems to me, but also it's a group biography, and that Kissinger is located particularly in this group of Hans Morgenthau, Hannah Arendt, and Leo Strauss, as kind of providing a fabric. And Morgenthau seems to me to be the thread who runs through that. He's Strauss's colleague, he's Arendt's friend, but he's Henry Kissinger's intellectual mentor. Tell us a bit about Morgenthau.
Before I begin to speak about Morgenthau, let me just say that I'm so pleased that you point out that it's an intellectual biography. This is not a book for people who want to get all of the facts of Kissinger's life. I present the key facts, as inevitably I would have to. But what I'm really trying to get at are the sources of his thought. Why does he believe what he believes? And for that, the key figure is Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau was Kissinger's mentor in many respects, and Kissinger, there was no thinker whom Kissinger admired more than Morgenthau. There were public figures that he admired, like Nelson Rockefeller, and I should add, Zhou Enlai. But among the intellectuals, there was no figure that he admired more than Morgenthau. And I have to confess that in some ways, Morgenthau is the hidden hero of the book. He takes over the book at various points. One of the striking points of history and in the relationship between Morgenthau and Kissinger is that Morgenthau opposed the Vietnam War from the very beginning, and I should say even before the beginning. He was sent to Vietnam to talk to the then president of Vietnam, Diem, with the expectations that he would come back as a supporter of the South Vietnamese government. And he came back as a critic, and he remained a critic throughout the war. He thought that this was an unnecessary and unfortunate expenditure of U.S. power, blood, and money. He never wavered in that. And yet one of his closest friends and someone who paralleled his thinking was Henry Kissinger, the man who prolonged the war for 4 long years. And what's amazing about the relationship is while it may have cooled, the letters drop off at that point, but it never evaporated. They always maintained a relationship, and later, after the war, the friendship returned. Morgenthau writes an article on Kissinger in which he says Kissinger is one of the great statesmen of American history. And that's after I think it was written in 1975. It was after their enormous disagreement on Vietnam. Now, why was that? And the reason was, though they came to different conclusions, they were operating out of the same principles and the same ideas. And those ideas go by the name of realpolitik, that the first thing that a statesman has to be aware of is the national interest, that if you pursue moral aims or idealistic aims without an awareness of power and the configurations of power, you will only get in trouble. And of course, for Morgenthau, that was the problem with the Vietnam War. We had gone in without any knowledge of the society, any knowledge of what it was possible to accomplish, and the result was a disaster.
Yeah, it's one of the really striking things about Morgenthau, but also about Henry Kissinger, is that there is a kind of a generosity and a Catholicity, actually, in the thought that you can come to different conclusions. For example, you quote him on Morgenthau, despite these disagreements, he says, "I never ceased admiring him or remembering the profound intellectual debt I owed him." But there's also, throughout the book, there are these friendships with people like Brzezinski, for example, who would have been on the other side politically, with Samantha Power, and the interesting relationship with President Obama, who Henry Kissinger, you say, thought quite highly of, even if he thought perhaps he was a bit passive.
Yes, that's right. Well, let's not forget 2 aspects of Henry Kissinger's personality. The first one, well, let's make it 3 aspects. The first one is that he's enormously charming, or can be when he wants to be. The second one is that he's intimidatingly intelligent. And then the third one is that he's always the opportunist. And that aspect of his personality is something that his critics glom onto, but forget the other aspects, the charm and the obvious intelligence.
What about this idea of tragic, the tragedy that is in the title? Obviously, this is related to Morgenthau. What does that idea mean, and how does it relate to Kissinger's thought as well?
These are both German Jewish intellectuals, and I should add to that they are basically conservative German Jewish intellectuals. They have a nationalist streak in them. Now, for both of them, that aspect of their conservatism was wiped away when the Nazis came to power. And one of the reasons that I focus on Kissinger and also Morgenthau, Leo Strauss, and Hannah Arendt is that they shared a certain, how shall I put it, sensibility. None of these thinkers was a Marxist. They were not Zionists, even though they were Jewish and didn't deny their Judaism, and in fact were always sympathetic to Israel, but they were not Zionists. They did not choose to live in Israel. And then the key factor, I would add, is that they were not liberal Democrats, using liberal in the very broad sense, they had great suspicions of how democracy worked. And it was something that Americans generally had trouble understanding. Morgenthau laments at one point after his first book comes out in America, they didn't understand what I was trying to say. I think there's perhaps a little more understanding about the limitations and dangers of democracy now that we live in the Trump era. And I began writing this book long before that. But these German Jewish intellectuals could never have a wholehearted sympathy for democracy because they had all experienced what democracy had brought to Germany in the Weimar Republic, which is to say Adolf Hitler. He was the most successful small d democratic politician in Germany in the later Weimar years. And this was something that was scarifying to these German Jewish intellectuals, and they could never forget that. So what were they left with? If they weren't liberal Democrats, Zionists, or Marxists, what were they left with? And I think the best expression of what they were left with was given by Hannah Arendt, who said you had to think without banisters, without foundations of any sort. And if you thought without foundations of any sort, in foreign policy, what that led you to was a kind of realpolitik that said the national interest is foremost. It can't be ideals. It can't be your desire for what you wish the world would be. You have to accept the world for what it is and work with that. And in working with that world, you're operating without full knowledge, you're operating often in the dark, and the results can often be tragic. That is, the results can lead to situations that you had not anticipated, had perhaps had done your best to plan for, but could never foresee. And so you could never know the ultimate consequences of your actions.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you bring out very nicely, the way in which these German Jewish exiles who'd fled from Nazi Germany, that the question of the implications that they had taken out from the horror of the Holocaust, and you contrast that so nicely with the way in which most Americans saw it as a horrifying aberration, whereas of course for them it speaks to what the real world is like.
I offer in the prologue a contrast between Kissinger's way of thinking and Condoleezza Rice's way of thinking. Now, she is someone, a black woman who grew up in the segregated South, and she argues that progress is possible, and in fact that the arc of justice, that the arc of history always bends toward justice. Her own life experience is an illustration of that. She believes that people around the world yearn for the kinds of freedoms that America has and offers them. Henry Kissinger's view is much darker. He does not view history as inevitable progress. He views it as almost a chaos of one damned thing after another, and that the results of history do not always lead in the direction of the good and the just. And his own ideas and his own thinking are shaped by that view, as compared to the much more American view that problems have a solution, that progress is inevitable even if there are stops along the way, and that democracy is the answer to all political questions.
Yeah, and you draw out Hannah Arendt's thought about the difference between the American and French revolutions, and that America mustn't lose the idea that freedom is the most important thing. It's not equality, which she argues the French Revolution became about. But then also this kind of idea in Morgenthau that it's not really a choice between good and evil, that essentially it's a choice between bad and less bad.
Yes, that's part of the tragic sensibility of all of these thinkers, which is to say that we really can't expect too much. And even when we arrive at solutions to specific problems, that does not mark the end of history, because then other problems will arise that will require other solutions, and our grappling in the dark once again to find our way through history's thickets.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, you touch on this a little bit, that kind of there's kind of anti-Semitism runs throughout the book. You handle it very, very lightly. But, for example, at one stage you have Alexander Haig saying that Kissinger's Jewishness made him, quote, not an American. And that seems to me to be something that is often kind of very slyly used against someone like Kissinger, that somehow this realist way of thinking, this way of seeing the world is somehow un-American, not American.
And perhaps Jewish in its sense of tragedy. I don't want to dwell too much on that because I'm not quite sure how far we can take it. What is true is that certainly some of the animosity on the right toward Kissinger came from his being Jewish. And I cite some of that in the book. But I think what's more important to talk about in terms of the anti-Semitism that he encountered is his notion of power and his relation to power. I quote, or you just quoted Haig, and I don't have a direct source from that, so I do say it's claimed that Haig said that, but we can all believe that Haig said that. It's not in the realm of improbability. But we know that Richard Nixon himself had deep anti-Semitic impulses. And at various points, at least on one occasion, though I think there were more, he would refer to Henry Kissinger to his face as my Jew boy. And the question becomes, why didn't Kissinger resign over that? And I think it's a very good question, and the critics will say he didn't resign because he was always power hungry and always an opportunist. I have a rather different interpretation, and my interpretation is that Kissinger, like Morgenthau, his mentor, believed that power doesn't go away. Someone is going to be operating the mechanisms of power through government. And is it better to be inside government trying to advise and temper the use of power, or to be outside government criticizing the use of power? And this is an issue that will always be with us, will never go away. Kissinger obviously made the choice to be inside and to try to exercise power in a rational, or at least in his lights, a rational way. Morgenthau was really forced to be outside because of his opposition to the war in Vietnam. But they both had an almost Germanic notion of power, which is that it exists, that it's always going to be there, that you can't deny it or hide your eyes from it, and that what you have to do is try to work through the power and not resist it. And in many ways, this is a very un-American idea, because Americans like to believe that the default position is minimal government, liberty, and power is something to be suspicious of and avoided. That was not Kissinger's view. That was not Morgenthau's view.
Yeah, you bring that out towards the end of the book, where you quote that very famous remark by Bismarck that the best a statesman can do is to listen to the footsteps of God, get hold of the hem of his cloak and walk with him a few steps of the way. That almost seems to be what you're describing there. And I guess actually there is a lesson that Kissinger learns from Bismarck through Morgenthau, that instinct, intuition in the practice of international affairs, that there are no perfect answers either for you personally or for the way in which you exercise power on the international stage.
Both Morgenthau and Kissinger, and I should add Strauss and Arendt as well, they are all in the camp that I'm about to describe, were very opposed to quantitative thinking, that one could arrive at truths by mathematical formulas or by counting noses or by taking the pulse of the public. None of them believed that. They all had a belief in human subjectivity and, most important, wisdom. And wisdom is a very hard word to define, and I don't think any of them defines it very well. But they all had a belief that wisdom, whatever it is, however we define it, has to take precedence over quantification and counting noses.
One of the things that I really like about the book is that you resist the temptation to make any kind of cheap political points, kind of even right up to the conclusion of the book. But there is a kind of a sense in which you are addressing the kind of general debate about the direction of foreign policy, how America should be both perceived and exercise its power on the world stage. So what do you think are the lessons and how can they be applied today from the work that you've done on Kissinger and his world?
I would say sharing this with Kissinger and with Hans Morgenthau, and I would add with Reinhold Niebuhr and George Kennan, I should say that if we want to think about foreign policy, these are the people that students should be studying, not just developing charts and graphs and mathematical formulas. They should be reading Niebuhr. They should be reading Morgenthau. They should be reading Hannah Arendt. And what I think they would get from that is a sense that foreign policy and history in general has a strong subjective element. And if you want, you can call that a moral element. And morality becomes a very tricky question for these thinkers. But moral in the sense that the individual is responsible for his own ideas and his own policies. And that's one thing that should be taken away from this book and from the lessons of these thinkers. Another is beware of idealism. Beware of marching into some place you don't understand simply because you have good intentions. Good intentions by themselves will lead to disaster. Kissinger and Morgenthau both say that. And I would say those are the lessons. It doesn't leave you with much, but it does give you a beginning to look at foreign policy.
So the book is The Inevitability of Tragedy, Henry Kissinger and His World. It's written by my guest, Barry Gewen, and published by W.W. Norton. But for now, Barry, congratulations again. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the book. Thanks for joining us on the American Interest podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard.
So that's it from us this week. Don't forget to check our website, theamericaninterest.com, and to subscribe to the show on your podcast app. The show is produced by Demir Marusik with Sean Keeley. Do join us again next time. But for now, this is me, Richard Aldous, saying be well and thanks for listening.